From The Economist in London, this is Money Talks, a weekly discussion of issues in the worlds of business, finance and economics. I'm Peter Collins, the business editor.
And I'm Adrian Wooldridge, the Schumpeter columnist.
For this special end-of-year edition of the podcast, we'll be looking at what we thought were three of 2013's most interesting issues in business. First of all, the huge run-up in the shares of tech startup companies. Secondly, the rise of the activist shareholder. And thirdly, why there are more women bosses, but still not that many. So first of all, Adrian, been quite a year for tech stocks. The previous year, we had the Facebook flotation, which wasn't a great success. Now it's way above its valuation, the stock market flotation, and it's joining the S&P 500, the big league. You've got the Twitter flotation this year, huge success, and you've got companies like Snapchat being valued at amazing amounts of money, turning down apparently offers of 3 and 4 billion without having any obvious means of support, so to speak. What's going on?
Well, in my view, I think what we're seeing here is a tech bubble, actually, just like the late 1990s and early 2000s. Absurd valuations being put on companies that don't have very good business models, certainly not sustainable business models. I can't remember the last time I actually used Facebook. I think these are just fads, and I think we're going to see a bubble bursting, and that's bad for everybody, because last time the bubble burst, it led to another series of burst bubbles throughout the whole economy. So these are leading indicators of an overinflated market.
Where I think you're right is that we're seeing all these companies come along, they catch on, they say we've got so many tens or hundreds of millions of users, and they're all being valued, it seems to me, as if they're all going to be the winners. And when we look back at these tech firms, you look at MySpace and all of these companies that looked like they were going to be the social media winners, and then something else came along and they faded away. So I think you're right in the idea that there's something awry with it, but maybe a bubble is going too far, because a bubble typically is when you get in a taxi and the taxi driver's telling you to buy shares in these companies, and you get home and your mother's telling you to buy shares in these companies. We don't seem to have quite reached that level yet, do we?
Not quite, but a lot of these valuations are driven by the fact that it's very easy to create a Facebook account or create a Twitter account. And everyone is very impressed by the fact they've got 10, 20 million users, but whether those users will actually stay and whether they can be monetized, I don't know. And if you look back at the history of technological revolutions, look back to the railway boom of the 19th century, most of these changes have actually been financed by gullible investors. They've had a series of bubbles, they've had a lot of investment which hasn't paid off. One or two people, one or two tech barons or one or two railway barons a century ago make out very well, but in the meantime, a lot of investors spend a lot of money not getting very much for what they're paying for.
And another part of this phenomenon that we've seen this year is new company comes along, a slightly earlier company, let's say a Facebook or a Twitter or whatever, tries to buy them. So for instance, we've had with Snapchat, there's these rumours that Facebook or possibly Google are interested in buying Snapchat for billions of dollars. What do you think's behind that?
Well, one thing that's behind this is the hunt for talent. I think a lot of people, they're not actually buying the company, they're not buying a business model or an idea. They see a bunch of bright, clever people and they think, we'll buy those guys. They might come up with the next Google, the next Facebook. It's called acqui-hiring, I believe, in the lingo. So it's the people, not the product, that's really been looked for.
What's interesting is in our end-of-year publication, The World in 2014, we're giving it a quick plug here, you've written an article arguing that all of the people who are behind these great tech companies, who we see as heroes, as sort of swashbuckling tech heroes, you think they're going to suffer some kind of a backlash. Why is that?
Well, I think that we've seen that there's a huge backlash against the plutocracy, backlash against bankers, backlash against oil traders, oligarchs of various sorts. The one group of people who've been left out of this backlash have been the tech people, because the tech people provide us with our nice iPads or our nice Facebook accounts or our nice Twitter accounts. But I wonder if this is going to go on. It's partly that these people are actually some of the most ruthless capitalists around. If you look at somebody like Mark Zuckerberg, he owns, I think, about 25% of Facebook. He's an exceptionally rich man. No single investor owns more than about 0.2% of Exxon. The tech people are the Vanderbilts, they are the Rockefellers of our time in terms of the concentration of ownership that they have. They employ very few people. They make very big profits. They are ruthless, Apple being an example of this, in exporting jobs abroad. Apple doesn't really do any manufacturing in the United States. It does it all via Foxconn in China. ruthless capitalists, and also I think that they've tended in the past to sort of fly under the radar of politics. But now two big issues. One is privacy, which they're involved in by necessity because they're gathering all this information and material, and the other is immigration, which they want to have a very liberal immigration policy. They're pushing for that, and I think those two issues annoy lots of people, and they put them right in the front line of politics. So a group of people who've been exempted from the backlash are going to be right at the front of the backlash, the techlash we call it.
So let's move on to our second topic now, which is the activist investor. Now, as you know, the daddy of them all, Carl Icahn, is in his late 70s. He's not a new phenomenon by any stretch of the imagination. And yet, if you look back at the year's business headlines, we've had these guys in the news all the time. Icahn is chasing Apple. You've got Bill Ackman, you've got Daniel Loeb, and all these guys chasing after companies, demanding that they shape up, disgorge their excess cash, get rid of divisions that are not working, and so on. What do you think's behind all of this?
Well, absolutely. I think it is one of the great business stories of the year. One argument would be that we're seeing really the revival of the corporate raiders of the 1980s, that these are the barbarians at the gate, beating at, trying to beat down the gate and take companies apart. I think there's something a lot more complicated going on here, partly that we don't see the sort of huge, inefficient conglomerates of the 1980s. Companies are pretty efficient at the moment. So what we're seeing is partly hedge funds, which have got a lot of money, trying to use that money. They've got a lot of money, but diminishing returns on that money. So they're trying to look for new outlets, to new prey. It's partly that there's a certain amount of fat to be taken out, but not in the way of the 1980s of taking companies and breaking them apart, but taking very, very carefully, looking at divisions, looking at the way that companies operate, looking at the way that boards are constituted, and being much more sensitive about them, about the restructuring of companies. And partly I see what I think from the big pension funds, you're getting a real desire. How do you fund your pension system? You know, pension returns are not high enough to meet the promises that have been made. So pension funds are becoming more sympathetic to activist investors. And I think also to some extent, boards are more willing to listen to investors, more willing to see themselves not as the champions of the management, but as the champions of investors as well. So they're listening to these people. So it isn't a hostile barbarians at the gate sort of takeover. It's a more sophisticated attempt actually to work with the companies and with the boards to try and improve the management of the companies.
Yes, it seems you've got a confluence of different influences there. You've got the fact that you've got investors who want the returns, the pension funds and so on. You've also got a realisation by the companies themselves that actually these guys may have a point at times. Also, the companies themselves have an awful lot of cash. There's been a lot of criticism of American corporations in particular for hoarding huge amounts of cash, for not investing it. So they're getting criticism from all sides for not investing and creating jobs and creating wealth, but also from the investor for saying, well, give us that money back. You know, that's what Icahn is saying. Apple, you've got lots of money. You could hand out some of this to us if you're not going to use it. It's interesting that it's reached a point in the past few days that the new boss of the SEC has sort of openly praised the activist investors, the good that they do. So they're not seen as these rapacious capitalists like the guys from the 1980s, the corporate raiders. They're seen as a much more, obviously they have their critics, but they're seen much more as a benign influence, aren't they?
Or as physicians. I mean, it may be a very successful rebranding on their part, but I also think there is the sense that they want to try and improve the performance of these companies. I think it's going to be a big thing in Europe, actually. This has been going on mainly in the United States. These are American activist investors, mainly working on American companies, and I think we'll see much more of it in Europe in the next few years. And also there are more European companies with a lot more fat to get rid of. So they've got very rich targets here, and also, of course, a pension fund industry here, which is desperate for improved returns.
So on to our final topic now, women bosses. Now, earlier in the year, of course, Sheryl Sandberg of Facebook, number 2 at Facebook, brought out her book Lean In, which looked at why fewer women than ought to be at the top of boards are at the top. And during the course of the year, we've seen Germany, the new German coalition, talking about the idea of bringing in quotas for women on boards, as some smaller countries have done. And finally, at the end of the year, we've had the announcement that Mary Barra will become the first boss of one of the big car makers in America. She'll take over at General Motors. If you look at the figures, it's easy to come up with a list, isn't it, of bosses who are female at big companies like Indra Nooyi at Pepsi, Ginny Rometty at IBM, and so on. But if you look at the figures, they're not that good, are they?
The figures are very low. It's about almost 5% of women running Fortune 500 companies. That's very low, and it's been sort of fixed at that level for quite a long time. What Sheryl Sandberg was arguing in Lean In is that women are there, but they don't, as it were, lean in. They don't make their presence known. They don't raise questions. They don't figure enough in the conversations. And she was urging the women who are there to lean in, not to phase out of the company, not to go onto the mummy track in their 30s, but to stay part of the game. And if they do, they'll be able to reach the top of companies. And I think the example of both Mary Barra at GM and Ginny Rometty at IBM is very interesting, because these are two very big companies. They're two engineering or IT-oriented companies. They're not sort of fashion companies or anything like that. And yet they've got two very powerful, very good CEOs. So I think we are beginning to see the lean-in effect working. Women working through the pipeline. People who've been working for companies as is the case in GM for 33 years, reaching the top. So it is small, 4.5%. It's not enough, but it's beginning to have an impact, the more female-friendly policies of companies. I think that over the next 20 years, we'll be reading more and more headlines about women reaching the very top of companies.
Thanks, Adrian. If you have any comments, please visit our Schumpeter blog at economist.com/blogs/Schumpeter. In London, this is The Economist.